Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here, and it's lovely to be with a British audience. It's quite a treat for me. I very rarely am, and I can tell it's your British audience because in the chat you're all talking about the weather. Jolly good. It's 20 degrees here, just in case anyone was wondering. I shall not dance on the table. So just some kind of housekeeping. At INSEAD, we are very unruly in seminars, and I'm used to kind of people interrupting and talking over and all that sort of thing. So I just invite you to use the chat and type your questions in or comments as you go along, and I'm happy to respond to them. You don't have to be very polite and wait to the end. In fact, I hope you're not, because it's very disarming when it's just me talking all the time. So my aim for today is I have sort of roughly 45 minutes, an hour, I think, of content. And then I'm hoping we can engage in a dialogue, but I'm really hoping we can engage in a dialogue throughout. My aim of today is really twofold. It's to give you a taste for system psychodynamic research, which is the way I approach most of my projects and my work. And it's not going to be a traditional seminar, because it's not just going to be me talking about the work of system psychodynamics or my work in it. I'm really going to try and talk about those two things, but also talk about me in the work. So as you know, Sigmund Freud is very famous for saying that all social science is autobiographical. And I would go one step further. And I would say that really good social science is not just a sort of reflection of us, but it also can shape who we are and who we become as people. And not just about our publications and our status and what we've achieved, but also about who we are in the world and how we approach the world and how we think about the world, and the person we become with ourselves and others. So I'm kind of hoping to share a little bit of that in the personal journey wrapped up in the research. And I'm going to compare my journey as a scholar to the journey of system psychodynamics research over the past 60 odd years. I'm not quite yet 60, but our timelines somewhat overlap. And I'm hoping that by the end of it, especially if you don't know much about system psychodynamics, that you know a little bit more and you get a taste for what a powerful approach it can be to humanize the world that we research, but also to humanize ourselves as researchers, and hopefully to humanize the organizations we work with. So that is my aim. Let's see where we get to. So this is what I'm gonna talk about. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the life cycle of system psychodynamic scholarship and compare that to the life cycle of me in the work. So the kind of birth, the youth, the growing up, and the midlife crisis. And I am 46 years old, so midlife crisis feels very, very appropriate at the moment. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about, well, what is system psychodynamic approach? And of course, I will be introducing and getting into the depths of it as we go through this afternoon. But I wanted to share with some of what I think of as just the overarching principles, or the sort of kind of really key tenets of this approach to research, just so you sort of understand what we're getting into. So there's really what I think of as four key principles here. The first is a deep appreciation that unconscious forces affect human functioning. What does that mean? Basically means we think we may be in control, but we're not, okay? So that a lot of what we do, what we say, how we act individually and in groups is driven by things that we're not aware of. Now, I want to pause for a minute and talk about the difference between non-conscious and the unconscious. So non-conscious are physiological reactions such as our reaction when we touch something hot, right? And we pull it away very quickly. This is non-conscious. We don't need to think about this. This is an automated process. The unconscious, and when I'll be talking about the unconscious today, is a little bit different. It's the same in that it can be out of our awareness, but it's a little bit different because it's a repository for the things we deny, the things we don't want to think about, things which have happened in our past that we've repressed, things that we find deeply disturbing. things which are symbolic and metaphorical in organizations. And system psychodynamic really takes these things very seriously and looks at how these shape organizing. And so the second principle is that system psychodynamics is a meso-level theory. It's a meso-level set of theories, and it's really interested in the interaction between the individual and the collective levels of analysis. And the way I think about it, and the way we sometimes think of it in system psychodynamics, is there's an inside out and an outside in. So let me start with the inside out. The inside out is, how does my psyche, my unconscious processes, impact how I shape organizations, whether that's at the group level, how I act in a group and shape a group process, or maybe if I'm the leader of the organization, how does that get projected into the culture of the organization? So that's inside out. Outside in is clearly the reverse. So how does the collective, the group, the organization I'm part of, shape my psyche and shape the way I act in an organization? And system psychodynamics is essentially looking at the interaction between the two and how these things co-evolve and shape each other over time. The third really strong feature or principle behind psychodynamic research is there's no such thing as an objective researcher. Okay, whenever you go into an organization, and in fact, Kurt Lewin was very famous for this saying, the minute you walk into an organization as a researcher, you are changing that system, right? By simply the act of asking people questions, even by sitting and observing, you are changing the system. So there's this participative stance towards being in the field and producing theory, that you are part of the system. And therefore, it's very important we understand our role in the research we're producing, as opposed to try and deny we have a role and say we're just independent observers who are completely neutral stance. I mean, we would, as system psychodynamic researchers, we would say, who are you kidding, to someone who said something like that. And the fourth key principle, and this is sort of where I want to start, is with the subversive intent. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean, system psychodynamics is born out of a certain period of history, which I'll come into in a minute, where the thought was, it's not good enough to just research. The research must have an aim to subvert something, which usually is authority, which usually is hierarchy, which usually is a system of dominance or power or control. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So there's a real tenet behind system psychodynamics research, which is, I guess you could summarize it as, so what? Like, why are we doing this? What's the point? What are we trying to move with this? And what structures and processes are we trying to break down? So that's just a little snapshot for those of you who have not come across the idea of system psychodynamic research much before. Okay, again, don't be quiet. You can tap into the chat at any time and I will try and reply. Okay, so let's start with the birth of system psychodynamic research. And for each of these areas, I'm going to talk a little bit about system psychodynamics and then myself in the work. So I'm going to start really as, where did this theory came from? And understanding this is really important, because one of the key assumptions of system psychodynamic is that the features and frictions of a system are observable at entry. What does that mean? I mean, as individuals, we might say it's all your mother's fault, right? If we were being silly. But it's really that the birth of a system, the birth of a way of organizing, the birth of an approach, the circumstances surrounding that birth hugely shape how that approach develops. And that's absolutely the case for system psychodynamics. So when we're doing system psychodynamics, we're very often looking at the features and frictions of a system at entry to try and understand how things pan out. So let's look at that for system psychodynamics itself. And really, system psychodynamics was born in the middle of the Second World War, which of course was a very particular situation. And I want to focus on one man in particular, Wilfred Bion. And really, we can track a lot of system psychodynamic theories and thinking down to Wilfred Bion, who eventually formed the Tavistock, started human relations, started a lot of things that we will know about. And he was a psychiatrist, a very decorated veteran of the First World War. And what happened in the Second World War is, after a couple of years, the British armed forces faced a real problem. Yeah, and the problem was this: most of the officers in the army had either been killed or been maimed. Okay, so they were not operational anymore. And they didn't know where to get new officers from. Now, the reason they didn't know where they would get them from is the selection criteria prior to this had basically been, are you from an upper class family? And if so, you are a born leader, and therefore you become an officer in the army. There was no sense that someone could develop leadership skills, could rise up the ranks and become an officer. It was totally class-based. But of course, if you kill all the young men in a certain class, you're faced with a problem, right? Who is going to take these roles? And so they turned to Wilfred Bion and was like, okay, you have a job, and your job is to figure out how we can select from these men who are not natural leaders, because they're not from the upper class, how we select leaders. And Bion brought a group of social scientists together, and they really started to look at what leadership is, and really started with this hypothesis of what if leadership is not a characteristic of individuals, but is a property and a product of a group. That a leader emerges at a certain point and a certain time. No one is a natural born leader, but it's really like, do they understand the group? Can they work the group dynamics? And can they lead this particular group at this particular time? And they developed a series of exercises called the leaderless groups, which many of us still use in all sorts of outward bound exercises to test leadership these days. But this one when they were developed. And so they put these ordinary men from ordinary families in these leaderless groups and observed them and saw the ones who rose to these leadership positions of informal authority. And so while he was doing this, he started to develop this theory of how groups could impact individuals and how individuals could move groups. And then he was given a second assignment. And the second assignment was, goodness me, we've got all these guys coming back with shell shock. How are we going to treat them? You're a psychiatrist, help us. And of course, in normal times, this would be individual treatment, but there were so many, this wasn't possible anymore. So Bion devised a way of treating people in the context of groups. And this is the first time this was ever done. And as the war ended, Bion started to write up his work from the war and really develop these theories of how, groups can harm and groups can also heal, and really started to look at this interaction between the individual and the group, and the individual and the organizational system. And so if we think about this ground where the foundational theories of system psychodynamics were born, it was really circumstances that led to a deep sensitivity of how working and organizing are essentially matters of life or death, right? Can I bring your life back through these therapy, these group work? And can I win a war through this group work to figure out who are the best leaders? And this work really had a political stance because it was anti-establishment. It was anti the upper classes make the best leaders. It was really an expression of care and an expression of kind of democratization. So if we think about the big theoretical leaps in this tumultuous birth, and there were really four big things. One is shifting Freud's theory of identification from the home to the workplace. So if we think of Freud's theory of identification, it was essentially that what constitutes me as a human, the way I develop into a human being, is by internalizing external authority. Now, for Freud, this was the parents, right? Your child, your caregivers as early children. And of course, they become models in your inner world. And then you spend the rest of your life struggling against these models. Of course, Freud would say that, right? So there's this struggle between, do I align with these models and be dutiful to the parents? Or do I pursue my desires and rebel and take all that on? And what BAM really saw was actually this also happens in organizations. And a lot of what happens in organizational life is this identification to authority figures and this struggle between the authority and the workers. The second thing that BAM did was really an anti-Taylorism. So if we think of Taylorism and those original theories of scientific management, they were all about productivity. The primary task of the organization was to produce something, widgets, whatever. And what BAM really saw was actually there were two tasks in an organization. There was, of course, the work task, the work to produce X, but there was a secondary task, which was the emotional management of the group's members. And what he started to see, both in those leaderless groups, which were selecting leaders, but also in those groups which were trying to care for and make men better, that if you only focused on the work task, it didn't occur. But if you focused on the emotional task, the work task would occur almost as a byproduct of getting the emotional task right. So there was this sense that you could look at organizations in two ways. And of course, the main problem is that we usually focus on the primary task, and then the secondary task, gets in the way. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And the third piece was, this was all action research. This was not about observing from a faraway stance, but really going in and, just like Kurt Lewin, trying to shift a system and see what happens. If I prod in this direction, where do I get to? So this was really the birth of system psychodynamics. And we can really see these principles work through up to the present day. And these principles are really about this unconscious element, the combination between work and emotions, the interaction between the individual and the group, and this sense of humanistic agenda. There's a really anti-Taylorism sense that you cannot just focus on productivity, you have to focus on care and the emotional management, otherwise you will never get that productivity. So this real dual focus. So this is the birth of system psychodynamics. Now I want to talk a little bit about my birth into the work, because that also shaped my journey and the research I've done and the papers I've worked on. And my birth started here, which is very much nicer than the trenches of the Second World War. So for those of you who maybe recognize, this is Zurich. So this was my sort of mid to late 20s, and my parents are academics. And of course, like many children, I was never going to be an academic. That was the last thing I would ever be. It didn't quite work out that way. So I went into business, and it was okay, but I sort of knew it wasn't really the thing for me. So in my late 20s, I went back and studied at IMD to do my MBA, really as a way of testing the water to move back into academia. And of course I did, as I'm here today talking to you. But as I went back in, it was just a very difficult year for me emotionally. And afterwards, I really needed a break. So I went to Zurich and started to study psychoanalysis at the Jungian Institute. And so here I am. On the one hand, I'm coming from organizations. I've had some pretty difficult experiences in organizations. And then I'm plunging into the world of depth psychology at the individual level and starting to think about research. And this is where I started my first big research project, which eventually, after many years, turned into an ASQ paper, looking at this tension between individuals' development and the needs of a system. And really this project was birthed from my own struggle between the difficulties I'd had in a system, in an organizational system, and my fascination with depth psychology. And also my distance past, I was brought up, I'm sure like many of you, brought up in 1970s Britain by baby boomer parents, where psychology was a dirty word. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. You just kept calm and carried on. And so discovering it at this very formative age in my late 20s, and these two worlds collided. And that's what really got me on the path of system psychodynamic research, was kind of the psychoanalyst combined with the organizational side. And I will talk a little bit about the fruits of that labor in a minute. So these are the dual births, right? The birth of system psychodynamic in a very tumultuous context. And my birth, which was in a very psychologically tumultuous context, but let's be honest, Zurich is not a practically, physically tumultuous context. And then both us and the work went into a period that I call defiant youth. Now, why defiant youth? Defiant youth because both system psychodynamics and the research I did really went against the grain of what the field was doing at the time. And for system psychodynamics, there were two fields, okay? There was the field of kind of psychiatry, psychology, and it definitely went against that grain by looking in organizations rather than in individuals. And it hugely went against the grain of organizational research by saying, these people matter and how they feel matter, and that's going to make a big difference to what they do in the organization. And in terms of how theory developed, there was, by the way, you're very quiet and it's making me a little nervous. Can someone just write something in the chat to make sure I'm not like talking to no one? just write a hello and I'll feel good. Yeah, thank you, Christine. I have a friend. And the real landmark study at this time in the early 50s, I'm going to talk about a couple, but this first one was a study by Elizabeth Menzies-Leibs in hospitals. And what was really interesting is she was an organizational researcher who was invited in to a hospital that had a problem. And the problem that was kind of displayed, the presenting problem, which we might say in psychoanalysis, the presenting problem was with turnover in the hospital. So there was high nurses turnover. The nurses were dissatisfied. We've clearly not moved on, right? Given I was listening to Radio 4 this morning, we're still in that place, right? There's high turnover. The nurses are dissatisfied. The service level is kind of not that great. And so she went in and she basically did an ethnography of the wards. And as she started to look, she started to realize their way of organizing just was not rational. It did not make any sense from a rational technical perspective. So the nurses were constantly rotating between wards. Their shift patterns were all over the place. And she just was absolutely befuzzled at the beginning. What on earth is going on here? And she suggested changes, but people were incredibly resistant to making what on the surface looked like incredibly rational changes. And the more she dug into this, the more she started to look at this from the difference between the task and the emotional task. And she realized that from the perspective of looking after patients, these rotations were a bit dysfunctional. However, from the task of managing the nurses' emotions, these rotations were incredibly functional, because what they did was they served to avoid nurses getting too close to certain patients. And of course, the problem with patients in hospitals is they can die. Okay, and that is not very pleasant if you've come to know someone closely and then they pass away in your ward. So to avoid this death anxiety and this anxiety of losing someone you've become emotionally attached to, these ward rotations worked really well. And essentially what Menzies-Leibs discovered was what I summarize as the functions of dysfunction, that something can look incredibly dysfunctional from the outside, from a task perspective, but when we think of it and understand it from an emotional perspective, it becomes a matter of life or death. It becomes incredibly functional. And she called these social defenses. Now, if we think about, I think defenses is one of these words we band around all the time. Oh, she's so defended. It's always the other person, right? Not us. And we understand an individual defense like denial, avoidance, something, but these were a social level defense. And a social level defense is a defense that people collectively invest into a structure or a routine or a process. So it's something that is externalized from the inside out, right? From my psyche into a structure in the organization. And this was really a breakthrough in understanding how organizations are organized, how we organize as a principle and as structures and processes, that it's not just to serve the task, it's to serve the emotional task. And so, and in this period, there were other studies in coal mines and all sorts of places that kept looking at this. What is dysfunctional about the system, and how can we try and make it functional while it's still serving a functional purpose for that emotional stream of management, which is so important in organizations. So this was a time when there were huge theoretical leaps made in the field. So this first one was this realization that we don't just join organizations to get work done, right? We also join them because they provide this containment, this emotional management that allows us to think, to feel, to act in certain ways, and of course, not in others. And this term social defenses came up, which we define as these collective arrangements. So very often structures or processes that are created and used by organizational members to protect against anxiety. And what's key here was the recognition that work is very anxiety provoking. And one of the key reasons work is anxiety provoking is exactly the same reason why it's anxiety provoking having a parent, okay? Which is, we identify with our parents, but there's this tension between, do I become my mother? Please no. Or, but I kind of also want to. Or do we strike out off on our own? Exactly the same in organizations, this idea of optimal distinctiveness. How much do I have to mold myself to the organization, and how much of it can I be an individual within the organization? And so what we see time and time again is this idea of depersonalization. Many organizations, they found at this period in time, were structured in a way that depersonalized work and depersonalized people with each other. So the multiple layers of hierarchy kept people across, or these strict processes which kept people out of touch with each other, all serve this really important defensive function that we don't then need to get into conflict with each other, right? We don't need to interact and risk loss or risk deep relationships that could hurt us. And so what happened at this time in the action research part was there was a real focus on the democratization of organizations. And this idea that how do we use these structures, not just defensively, but as in developmentally? So Tristan Bamforth did a lot of work, for example, in coal mines, looking at how can they get autonomous functioning among the workers, right? Okay, we've come full circle back to this now, right? How can we get people working independently as a way to increase this emotional holding and management, and at the same time increase productivity? So how can we juggle these two balls at once? And at this point, there was this real cautious optimism, because there was this sense that, okay, if organizing can constrict the self, given the right conditions, it can also set the self free. And if we can just figure out what those conditions are and create them in an organization, we can really transform organizations. And so the goal at this period was to develop among the researchers and among the research this reflective capacity. And at this stage, what you see in the researchers is there's almost a joint venture between the researchers and the research to try and redesign, to try and rework things in a way that build this reflective capacity and set people free in their development at work. So this is this period of the defiant youth. And of course, you can imagine in the 1950s, this was incredibly radical. Imagine going into an incredibly hierarchical nursing station at a hospital, or an incredibly hierarchical print shop or factory, and saying, actually, the foreman and the manager and the plant manager, these layers are really unhelpful. We're going to look at organizing in a different way. It was very, very sort of against the grain. And so this was the step that really took systems psychodynamics from what I might think of as more clinical organizations into the kind of organizations that you and I care about and that you and I work in. And it was a time of big kind of theoretical leaps. So obviously, real time wise, this is before my time. This is in the 50s. But I think in my research, I also recognize this period of defiant youth. And it's a period where I was also transitioning from one institution to another. And the first is I was transitioning into my own family, right? Into my own kind of family. And for those of you who have children, you will know that psychologically, it brings up a lot, right? It's the, when we have children, it's the arena where we really see the compulsion to repeat, like, oh my goodness, my mother would have said that, right? Or, oh, I remember my parents doing that, right? We really see this repetition from authority figure to authority figure. It's also where we learn viscerally in ourselves about attachment, right, and containment. And for me, these ideas of attachment and attainment, which I was reading a lot about when the kids were this age, really set up the next stage of my journey and the next stage of my research, which I'll come to in a moment. And so this is the time when these seeds were sown, when I was kind of taking that leap out. It was also a time when I was embedding into kind of rather iconic institutions. So one was INSEAD, which is in itself an interesting institution because it was born out of World War II. And the founding principle of INSEAD was to stop war again. So it was a number of institutions built across Europe with the idea that if people came together and worked and built businesses, it would be too expensive for them to basically have war with each other. So there was a real mission that was built out of this. And the early foundation of INSEAD, there were a lot of people working on this kind of clinical system psychodynamic side. And then I went to Harvard Business School, which is another rather kind of iconic institution, and an institution where some of the early system psychodynamics people have passed through Clay Alderfer, Kurt Lewin, all those people were moving in these cycles. And yet, when I entered these two institutions, system psychodynamics was, stating you wanted to be a system psychodynamics scholar was basically career suicide. So I was very much the rebellious teenager, right? My tumultuous youth in these organizations. It would be like, you what? No. That's what people did in the 50s and 60s. Like, no, we don't do that anymore. And this was a time, if we think back to the sort of early 2000s, this was a time when positivism was on the rise. It was all about quantifying. Everything was rational. Everything was objective. And I was really taking a different tact of looking at this. But this was a time when I got my first publication. And for those of you, obviously, I'm sure we're all published, like, it's a big deal when you get your first publication, like, it's a massive deal. But it was a particularly big deal for me because what I'd done in this first publication with John Piero is really taken this love of system psychodynamics and used it to interrogate the new institutions we were in, the institution of a business school, and used it to really interrogate, why is it that business schools were so hot at that time, right? Why was it that people were pouring money into sending people to business schools? And business schools were no longer just claiming to impart knowledge or train people. They were claiming they were going to transform people. This is like a pretty radical claim. And we started looking at this and really came to understand that business schools were being used as a social defense, just in the same way that the ward rotations were for Menzies' time. what was happening in business schools is that people were coming up with the fantasy that if you get a degree from one of these places, you will be insulated from uncertainty in the markets. Okay, now we know that's not true. You know that's not true. I know that's not true. However, this collective fantasy created this defense in which it was almost irresistible not to go down this route. And so business schools, because they had this strong social defense, became a place where we worked on our identities and we sort of moved forward. And of course, it was just like, it's so great getting a publication at any time. Getting your first one is amazing. And it was also great because we had such a reaction to it. Now, on the one hand, this is positive, like, oh, wow, like you can apply this stuff to modern day things. And at the same time, there were some people who were really viscerally negative towards it. Now, as you know, and if you've read any Freud, he would say, if people really didn't care about something, they just wouldn't react. Okay, so a visceral negative reaction points to you being onto something. So it was like, oh, okay, this has created quite a reaction. Like we carry on this stream. And here we come to the third phase. And here I'm realizing I'm going to have to talk really fast to get through all of this. I'm going to speed up a bit. If I'm talking too fast, tell me. So this third phase, this growing up to care, is when system psychodynamic scholarship, and when my scholarship in particular, took a relational turn. So if we fast forward to the 70s and 80s, what was happening is, you know, Donald Winnicott was coming on with his theories. Attachment theory was being born, and we started to really try and understand the care element of organizations in greater depth. We had done a good job, scholars had done a good job to really look at the defensive side of organizations, but now it was a time to really look at why is it that this action research works so well. And people started to look at two things in particular. One is the idea of containment, right? Psychological containment. And the idea that the mere presence of researchers in an organization, in an institution, shows a certain amount of care, and their interventions show a certain amount of care. And therefore, you can kind of shift an organization by simply being fully there. And this is really a groundbreaking paper by Bill Kahn in the late 80s. And he researched a lot of caregiving organizations, so kind of social workers, this sort of thing. And he really came up with these theories that were system psychodynamics theories, but pulling in these relational theories of psychoanalysis, looking at holding environments, looking at containments, and looking at this importance of being fully there in organizations. Now, what does fully there mean? Fully there. So this is an amazing book. I'm sure many of you have read it. All That We Are. It's by Gabriella Brown, my book of the year. And it's what she calls, like, I mean, there's sometimes debate, which is ridiculous, like, oh, should you bring your whole self to work or not? Well, you don't have any choice. It comes with you wherever you go. The question is, do you acknowledge it or not? And Bill's research really showed that being fully there doesn't necessarily mean telling everyone everything, but it's like, can I be present in the here and now? And if I can, then my capacity to contain and to provide a holding environment is huge. And this can really unlock individuals' capacity for development, but also organizations' capacity for development. And so this really moved the field on another big bound towards this caring side, right? Back to the original BAM. And so this theoretical leap enabled us to research things like holding environments, like how do we contain the anxiety so that we can then work and move on from it. And this idea that the goal was to craft an organization in which people felt safe enough, not safe, but safe enough to be fully there and present and create this. Carol, I'll come to your question in a minute. And then there's this movement, there's a parallel movement from the outside in to the inside out. So in Menzies' work and other people's work, we very much looked at the organization's effect on individuals. And Manfred Vries, Mark Stein, and others really started to look at the opposite. How is it, especially leaders, how is their psyche projected onto organizations and shape organizations? Okay, so Carol has a question around what kind of evidence do we base conclusions on? So first of all, it's all qualitative evidence, obviously. It's very hard to quantify these things. And we tend to triangulate evidence. So most of my projects, Bill's projects, other people's, will have some kind of observational, not necessarily ethnographic, as you go and sit in an organization for 6 months, but some kind of ethnographic observational evidence, plus interviews, depth interviews with people, and often plus another kind of data as well. It might be archival, it depends a little bit on the context. So the idea here is the triangulation of evidence across these levels. I would also say, and I'm sure you find this, Carol, with PhD students, right? Oh yeah, qualitative research, easy, I just talk to people, right? And then I know, it's a real skill to collect this kind of data. So the bar for publishing, certainly in the journals I publish in, is you need some kind of clinical training to collect this data. Now, that does not mean you need to be a psychiatrist. Let me be very, very clear, okay? But some kind of training in sensitivity. So I've trained at the Tavistock Institute. There's all sorts of trainings to really think about how do we interrogate these dynamics and how do we look at them across. But we're looking at quite large sample sizes, for example. So there's my most recent study, which is I've just resubmitted last week to ASQ, is sort of 60 odd people in it. So we're looking at fairly large sample sizes plus observations. Jared, how does the psychoanalytic approach differ from the dual process theory? Yeah. So the reason they're related, the key difference is the systemic piece. Okay, so if we think about cognitive emotional dynamics, we're very often looking at like, I feel anxious, therefore I react badly in a negotiation, something like this. System psychodynamics, and I'll just focus on social defenses for a moment because that's one of the concepts I introduced. How this differs is it's a collective emotional, psychologically emotional management process, which then translates into organizing. So the difference is the multi-level and the connection to organizing. So organizing could either be how we structure ourselves, how we structure processes, and also how we proffer narratives. So there's an excellent paper, 2020 in ASQ by Padovic, Ely, and Reed, which looks at this at the narrative of the kind of gendered narrative in an organization and how that is a social defense. So it's not necessarily just a ward rotation structure. It could also be a narrative, and it could be processes as well. Okay, thank you. Okay, so and this was a time when my research was really flicking in this direction as well. And I want to just talk about a couple of projects very quickly because I'm looking at the time. So the first is this project where I took perhaps the smallest system possible, which is the system of a couple, and really looked at the psychological structures we build collectively in couples, which is this attachment structure, and seeing how that influences the individual professional development of each person within the couple. And I still remember, so we have a boy and a girl, and our son's the eldest, and our son was, was like 4 weeks old. He was an awful sleeper. It was just like he slept about 5 hours out of every 24. It was a nightmare. And I remember by week 3, I had thrown every single parenting book in the bin because they were all like, by this age, your baby should sleep 14 hours a day. And I was so distressed. I just threw them all in the bin. And instead I went online and I ordered a load of attachment theory books. I was just like, I'm done with, I don't know, Gina Ford or whoever. And this in some ways was the kind of expression of that kind of real getting into this attachment theory and starting to apply it in organizations. At the same time, with Giampiero, we were really starting to build the practical side of the work. And so we were starting to work with a group of colleagues at INSEAD to bring these theories into our teaching in INSEAD. And this period in particular, the sort of 2010 onwards, was a time when this work and our practice, now understanding of how to apply these group level ideas of psychology, link them to organizing and link them to the culture of an organization, and then back down to the effects of individuals and on individual leaders who really kind of come into a fore. So this is a time we were really honing that practice of applying these theories and understandings to practice. And of course, sort of translating that into this paper in particular really talks about that work of applying this concept of kind of what is happening at the group psychological level, how does that shift organizing, and how does that shift our individual experience, and then how do we work with that in that paper. Oh, thank you, Christian. Yes, that is the paper. Brilliant paper. I highly, highly recommend reading that paper. So this is the Growing Up to Care, and this was a time of massive generativity for system psychodynamics and for us personally. And then, midlife crisis. And we all have them, right? And you all know it's going to come, and then you think, oh, it's not going to be that bad, and then of course it is. And for system psychodynamics, it's a really curious midlife crisis, because system psychodynamics had been incredibly generative so much so that many of the concepts, the constructs, the language had seeped into our everyday parlance, right, and become accepted, and people had even forgotten where it came from, right? So defense mechanisms and avoidance and all this sort of stuff. And Giampiero and I wrote a paper last year, and we really used the metaphor of the gladiator. So I don't know if you've seen the film, but there's this moment in the film where Russell Crowe, at his best, and he kills all these people on the field, and then he shouts up to the emperor, "Are you entertained?" In a huge challenge to the emperor's authority, because he's basically being made to kill all these people for entertainment, okay? And we used it to really convey our sense of frustration with the field at this time, in that there'd been this hugely amount of generative work, and yet system psychodynamics remained hugely on the periphery. And in fact, Mike Pratt wrote this paper, this really interesting paper about the unconscious in organizing, and said, it's so fascinating that it has been pushed to the periphery of organizational theory. And that word pushed is really important, right? Because it was pushed to the periphery. Again, at a time when, what's your sample size? Is there 3,000? Can you prove it? What's the correlation? This sort of stuff. And coming back to Jim March, it was like the plumbing and the poetry. And the organizational studies had really I nearly said dumbed down, which is such a Freudian slip, doubled down and dumbed down on the plumbing, right? And without stepping back and thinking, what's the macro meaning of this? So there was a move away from meso-theorizing to either very small individual level theorizing, the rise of the social psychologist, or massive macro theorizing, which kind of is about the organization and the institution, but takes the individual out of the picture. And this middle had been lost. And in fact, this was when we were first writing. And what's interesting is the paper I first studied, my first publication, we sent it to Human Relations, and it got straight desk rejected. It wasn't very good at that stage, but anyway, because it was irrelevant to organizational studies. That was the feedback we got. And so this is a time when, it was just kind of lost in this wasteland. And as we started to think about this, it's easy to think, oh, poor us. But as we started to interrogate this, we really came to realize that the marginality that system psychodynamics had on the surface can look bad, right? But we really came to see it as a functional thing. Because to remain grounded in a subjective stance when the world is turning positivist, and it requires some courage, right? It requires us to stick to this idea of radical interpretism, to stick to this idea that it's not just about the productivity, right? There is an emotional side of organizing, and how do these two things interact? And in fact, what was happening at this time is there was still a group of dedicated scholars kind of plugging away and pushing things out. And in fact, what's happened in the last 5 years in particular has been a huge resurgence of the approach. And what's interesting is not in specialist journals, but really in the kind of top journals of the field. So I'm sure you've read many of these papers, but there's a huge number of ASQs now, things in AMJ, things in kind of all the top American journals, in human relations, etc. And so there seems to be this resurgence out of this midlife crisis. And my experience as well has been very similar in that I don't know how it is in the UK, which is really weird. I know I'm British, but sort of I'm in INSEAD, which is really in the American system. And there's very much been a movement to volume over quality, right? So how many papers have you published? It doesn't matter about the citation count. It's just about how many beans do you have? Who cares how big the beans are? And I think it's a time when, you get tenure, you've done all this stuff, and then you're like, oh my goodness, now what? And even though, I published all these papers in these great journals, there was a sense of it's very hard to stay true to your academic self when there's this pressure to kind of publish volume over quality. And so really the last couple of years, I've been questioning, where do we go from here, right? Where do I go from here, and where does the field go from here? And I think when we get to that stage of questioning, certainly my experience is we've got to come up with an answer to the question, why, right? Why stick to this? I mean, quite frankly, why stick to anything? And I think the only answer that I can come up with for me personally and for the field is that I think this matters. And it matters for me. And I also think it matters for the project of humanizing organization studies and for humanizing organizations. And, in organization studies, you've read the same essays as me. There's a loss of meaning. There's a rise of positivism, as if the world is a rational place, right? As if we can observe things independently, as if we can take an objective stance, which is ridiculous. And as if we should just report and not try to change and just be observers on the sidelines. And of course, and look where the world is. And also, I think there are really big changes in the world that system psychodynamics can help us with. So I want to sort of go through 3 and then open it up to more comments and questions, because I'm feeling like I've spoken a lot. So the first thing is, we know there are huge polarizing forces in our societies. We see this in every country. We see it in the US. We love talking about the US, but it's also happening in the UK. It's happening in France. It's happening in Italy. It's happening in Germany. It's happening across the world. And this is, of course, this happens under time of uncertainty and crisis. And we know from that post-war research, from that foundational system psychodynamics research, that how do we tackle polarization is through containment. And the reason polarization happens is because people feel uncontained, because they're anxious, that they get dragged to the poles. And so this idea of containment and working with and theorizing about containment and understanding how we can get containment into organizations and societies is, I would say, more necessary than ever. And this is bread and butter of system psychodynamics. The second thing is almost the polar opposite, right? If you read a copy of Harvard Business Review, The Guardian, whatever, you will see this narrative for meaningful work, for humanizing workplaces, for passion, for callings, all this sort of stuff. There's a real visceral pull to it from workers. And you can't just get this stuff if an organization is organized simply for productivity. You really need to help organizations understand, and for us to really interrogate, how can organizations engender this combative care, not care as in nanny state, let's just look after everyone and give them mental health days, don't get me started on that, but how do we combine care with productivity, right? This is more necessary than ever. You know, we have a burnout crisis, we have a mental health crisis. How do we pull these things and really integrate these two things in organizations? Again, bread and butter of system psychodynamics theory. And finally, of course, we are living in the age of anxiety, a great book, if you haven't read it, actually, The Age of Anxiety. And this makes the understanding of social defenses more necessary than ever. I think everyone now can talk about an individual defense, right? You're like, oh, you're avoiding that, or you're denying that, or whatever. But, you know, there's a lot less understanding of these social defenses. And because there's so much anxiety in the air, because there's so much anxiety in organizations, in societies, these social defenses, I imagine, are becoming much more prevalent and much more structured, and therefore much more difficult to see without someone revealing them to us. Again, bread and butter of system psychodynamics. And that's why I think it's just a really exciting time to be in this field, to be doing this work, and to be doing stuff which feels very important for the world at this moment in time. So I think I ran over a few minutes, but I'm going to stop there. And I'm just very happy to take comments, questions. I think I'm going to turn off this